All right, everybody. This is part 3 of 10 for our videos. We're into November here. So this is emotions, narratives, and meaning making. It builds off a lot of what we've already done. I mean, all of these are going to build off what we've already done. That's kind of how the nature of the course is. So we're going to take a lot of what we've learned from emotions. We're going to take what we've learned from Brene. We're going to start applying it to one of my, not to give too much away, but more preferred styles of therapy, known as narrative. We're going to talk about it at a bit more of a surface level today, and then later on in this course, we'll go into it in a bit more detail. But you're going to get really the underpinnings and how it works and what it's built on today. Okay, here we go. Okay, so first, real quick recap here. So, emotions. We spent a bunch of time talking about emotions and how they interact with Brene Brown's 4Bs. So just as hopefully these are starting to get embedded into your brain at this point. But biology, which is literally what chromosomes and DNA information your birth parents gave to you. Your biography, which is going to be the story that you tell of your life. That's going to be big in today. Your behaviors, which as part of the cognitive behavioral therapy triangle we spoke about, this is going to be the go-to behaviors that you do when things happen. Everyone has different ones. That's why people respond to similar situations in very different ways sometimes. And then backstory is going to be all of your lived experiences, not necessarily the parts of how you saw them, but how um, how they actually happened. So whether or not somebody had a really nice, easy upbringing, or whether it was more of a traumatic, challenging one, that's going to be your backstory. So as you can imagine, biology kind of shows. I haven't said this directly, but biology kind of shows up first, and it's expressed right away. That's why kids, when they have almost nothing when they're first born, still have some responses. That can very easily play into your backstory, especially from age 0 to 6, but really for our whole lives. 0 to 6 making the majority of our backstory. Ironically, the parts that we least are able to reflect on and remember, but are in fact the ones that are the most powerful. That then creates the story that we tell ourselves, and we create a lot of that, especially between 12 and 18. It can be a really tumultuous time, as I don't need to probably tell many of you. A lot of changes, both in body and in friendships and everything else. And then that creates a lot of the go-to behaviors. A lot of those behaviors are crafted from both what we take from our backstory and create in our biography, and also what we learn from our parents. And in this case, I don't mean the biological ones. I mean whoever's with us, which of course could be the same, but aren't necessarily the same. So we're going to keep that in mind a lot today, and we're also going to pair that with the cognitive behavioral therapy and just understanding that interplay between the feelings, thoughts, and behaviors. Okay, so we're going to jump into some newer material here. This is about emotions, narratives, and empathy. Um, narrative, for the sake of it here, is going to be basically stories. Think of it that way. Emotions and empathy we've already talked about. So the general feeling is that nothing is in isolation. Some people have said your very first thought when you show up maybe out of a hospital 1 second to 10 seconds after you're born, you have your very first thought in isolation of everything else, where you haven't had opportunities to create stories and meaning from everything else. But the reality is, actually in our DNA, really interestingly, is the ability to be able to connect and to look for others. So if you look up at your mother or a caregiver, or maybe even the doctor who's holding you, you have your first response, and it's not your first emotion, and it's not even really in isolation, but sometimes we like to say it is. And from that point off, everything you do is linked back to previous things. Not every thought at your age now is linked back to every thought you've ever had, but you're looking for similarities, and you're looking for ways to understand it through your previous experiences. There have been twin studies that have been done on this kind of thing, which are kind of interesting. Two people with identical DNA from their biological mother and father, and they're raised in different circumstances and have completely different understandings of the world. They tend to have very similar IQs and abilities, um, although not identical, because your surroundings affect that as well, but very similar. However, you can have incredibly different narratives, different stories about how you see the world. So we also know that we take these narratives and we like to see them, and we expand them with everything around us. So when we read books, as I write there, we create impressions and narratives about characters that fit for us. Some of our favorite characters in books are ones that we can identify with, or that we can identify something that we really like in somebody else. We do this very subconsciously. Often we'll like characters and we won't have actually thought about it. But if you break down some of your favorite characters and your favorite people from books and movies and shows, you'll probably find that there's a lot of similarity between people that you admire, or that you in the real world, or you admire in something you admire in yourself, and what you see in those characters. That's how we kind of fit everything in, and that's how we identify. Now, this also, as point three kind of says, has a lot to do with empathy and has to do with something called tribalism. I'm going to break it down to more of a more simple than it really is. But tribalism at its core basically says that we need to live in groups in order to be able to guarantee survival for ourselves. For 100,000 years, we talked about the brain unit, living on the plains of Africa. If you didn't have a small group of people, generally thought to be at its best around 50 to 100, if you didn't have that, you couldn't guarantee finding enough food, having um, enough people to take care of the young, take care of the old, to be able to patrol your site to keep away lions and other things that might endanger your safety. And as a result of that, we create these tribal networks and build empathy, where we all look after each other and we can see ourselves in other people, which is at the core of empathy. Um, so all of these things are playing together. As I have it on the right there, you can see there's the mirroring and the neural coupling, the dopamine kicks that we get, and the cortex activity. Um, all of the experiences that we have linked to previous experiences will affect future experiences and are based around ideas of tribalism, empathy, and the ideas of survival. When a new event happens, as point four says, we look for how it fits in previously to emotional responses. We're building a story. I think it's kind of interesting to think that from the moment you're born until the moment you die, you're creating one giant story of how you see the world and everyone in it. Um, yeah, it's just kind of interesting. So we'll use a lot of this understanding as we go through today, or I should say next week when we meet. Okay, so this slide is all about the places we go in, which you might remember from last month. And on the second of the three circles moving outwards, you can see the different sorts of things we do, and what the most common emotions that link to that are. So if we look at, for example, at the very top, the blue one there, things aren't what they seem. We're going to spend a bit of time in class going through this, doing a bit of an activity, but you'll see things that aren't what they seem, and then you have sarcasm, irony, paradox, cognitive dissonance. We'll probably talk about that in class. Nostalgia, bittersweetness, and amusement. You'll notice a real range of how you might feel about each of those as you hear it. Some of them, some of them are more positive feeling, and some of them more negative feeling as a baseline. However, they all have that commonality of something has surprised us and they wasn't what we originally thought. Um, we're going to use elements of all of this circle and have you write it down. The reason we like to group these things together is to understand that similar emotions, and I gave this example of love and hate, similar emotions are not necessarily things we think of as being opposite of each other in how we feel about them. The opposites of each other are going to be much more complicated than that. Okay. Okay, I won't say too much about it now because this is going to be a main activity that we do in class. But the roots of empathy, or the sharing roots activity, is something that we are going to do specifically to be able to help us understand with actual examples how different people are experiencing the exact same situation of doing an activity together in class differently. Um, It'll help us understand a little bit. I mean, it's going to give us just a little look, but you can go much further with this later if you want. It's going to give us a little bit of an insight into what information we take from things that happen. So we know that different events are experienced differently from different people. A lot of different words there. Different events are seen differently for different people, depending on all of the things that we bring to the table from our previous life experiences. We also know that what we pick out from what people share with us is different. So it's getting kind of meta, I know, but you're going to find that the more you better understand, as we kind of spoke last month, the more you better understand what's going on for you, the more likely you are to be able to predict outcomes and to be able to prepare for those if you don't like them. Okay, this will be the second part of the empathy exercise that we're going to do, so I won't say too much, but essentially in this activity, you're going to actually start putting down onto paper the things that you remember and the things that really stuck with you from the activity we did. And it'll give us an opportunity to talk about it as a large group and see how different people felt different things. It's an opportunity to learn by experiencing through yourself and through others. Okay, and so on this final slide here, this is narrative therapy and kind of how it all links together and brings it together. As I say, we will do more on narrative later on when we look at probably four different therapies towards the end of the class around Unit 9, I think, Unit 8 or 9. But for a quick overview and to get a sense of how this can work, narrative therapy is one of literally over 100 therapies that exist. It's non-pathological, which means that it does not have any of its roots in diagnosing. Narrative therapy, quite interestingly, would not care if you are someone with an anxiety disorder, for example. It's not looking to diagnose. It's not taking diagnoses that may exist and using them in a meaningful way. If you identify as someone being anxious, that's important to know. But being somebody with an anxiety disorder on its own is not used. Now, it's helpful, as I say here, because narrative therapy's entire premise is key point here as meaning making machines, which is what we really are. We make meaning out of everything. We let some narratives steer our lives more than others. And this is at the core of how some people live much more pleasant, enjoyable lives, and other people don't. The stories that we let dominate are going to be the stories that affect us the most. And so, as I put in bold, kind of with the arrows there, and that just means leads to understanding your emotion leads to understanding your narratives, right? So, the second month with emotions leads to this one, the third month with narratives. And then that leads to the agency, which really just means ability, the agency to change how you see and interact with the world, as well as where you see yourself in it. For those of you who are particularly interesting, I put up the techniques of narrative on the side there. So this is kind of the order that it usually goes in. It's much more complex, really, and we'll go into this more detail later. But essentially, the therapist would help identify the narrative that's going on. So the client is going to share some of their experiences of what's going on, and they're going to tell it essentially as a story with emotions. The second, the narrative therapist uses this crucial thing in narrative therapy that's also done in some others called externalizing the problem. This means separating the person from the problem, helping the client understand that they themselves are not the problem, but that the problem is something that's getting in their way and that they can get outside of themselves. Um, it's kind of the key stage in narrative therapy. So first the story, then the externalizing, and then part 3 is deconstruction. So this is where the therapist might help the client help understand that we can take the problem that's now external from us and break it down into small parts that could be dealt with. Because often when people are trying to deal with something really significant in their lives, it feels overwhelming to know where to start and how to deal with it. And so the deconstruction component is really about getting to what do we do about these. And then part 4 is unique outcomes, as it says. This is helping the client create a new dominant story. Now we know that we have many stories that go through us, and that we are the sum of literally dozens of stories, probably more, in fact, for most of us, that help explain ourselves and help us see the world, create our worldview, if you're familiar with that phrase. But now we need to create a new dominant story that's going to replace the problematic narrative that the client showed up with. And so a lot of this is about finding and identifying uh, different ways of seeing the world, asking questions like, well, if it isn't just that you're always anxious, what else could it be? So that they can help come to their own conclusions. Yeah, so that's basically a really quick rundown on narrative therapy. As I say, it goes with a lot of what we do in this class, and I find it a pretty useful tool for using. Okay, thanks for following. Lucky for you, a bit of a shorter one this week.